The Senate Banking Committee room fell silent as Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana adjusted his glasses, his expression calm despite the storm brewing before him. Across the chamber, Congresswoman Maxine Waters leaned forward into her microphone, her voice sharp as she launched into a blistering attack. "Senator Kennedy, your state ranks near the bottom in education, healthcare, and poverty. You have no right to lecture anyone about financial management," Waters declared, her voice echoing through the chamber. "You're just another Republican trying to protect big banks while regular Americans suffer." The gallery erupted, supporters of Waters nodding in approval, while Kennedy's allies shifted uncomfortably in their seats. For a moment, Kennedy remained perfectly still, his folksy demeanor unchanged as Waters continued her assault, clearly believing she had cornered the Louisiana senator. What happened next stunned everyone in the room. Kennedy slowly reached for a folder that had been sitting in front of him. A folder no one had paid attention to until that very moment. As he opened it, a slight smile crossed his face. In just 90 seconds, John Kennedy would turn this confrontation completely upside down, leaving Maxine Waters speechless for perhaps the first time in her long political career. This wasn't just another congressional hearing. It was about to become one of the most shocking political confrontations in recent memory. Before we dive into exactly what Senator Kennedy did that silenced Congresswoman Waters, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. You don't want to miss our coverage of the biggest political showdowns in Washington. To understand the magnitude of this confrontation, we need to recognize who these two political figures are and why this exchange matters so much. Maxine Waters, the 83-year-old veteran Democrat from California, has served in Congress since 1991. As chairwoman of the House Financial Services Committee, she's known for her fiery rhetoric and unwavering progressive stance. Her supporters view her as a fearless champion of the underprivileged who isn't afraid to speak truth to power. Her detractors, however, see her as a divisive figure who often makes accusations without evidence. Throughout her career, Waters has built a reputation for aggressive questioning during congressional hearings. She rarely holds back, often interrupting witnesses and fellow lawmakers alike. Her confrontational style has made her both celebrated and criticized, but one thing is certain: few have ever managed to leave her without a response. Across the political aisle sits Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana, first elected to the Senate in 2016 after serving as Louisiana's state treasurer. Despite his Harvard law education, Kennedy cultivates a folksy, plain-spoken persona that masks a razor-sharp legal mind. His Southern drawl and homespun analogies often lead political opponents to underestimate his intellectual firepower, a mistake they typically regret. Kennedy, 71, serves on the powerful Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee, where he's earned a reputation for asking blunt questions that cut through political double talk. While Waters leads with emotion and righteous indignation, Kennedy relies on facts, figures, and a lawyer's precision. This particular hearing had been called to address new financial regulations proposed by Waters' committee. The proposed rules would impose stricter requirements on regional banks across America. Regulations that Kennedy argued would devastate small businesses in states like Louisiana by restricting access to capital. The stakes were enormous. Waters' regulations, if implemented, would impact banking policies across the nation, potentially affecting millions of loans to small businesses and homeowners. For Kennedy, this wasn't just political theater. It was about protecting his constituents' livelihoods. As the hearing progressed, tensions had been building steadily. Several witnesses had testified about the potential impact of the regulations, with experts divided along predictable political lines. Waters had been dismissive of concerns raised by Republican committee members, frequently interrupting their questions with points of order. When Kennedy's turn for questions came, Waters immediately went on the offensive, perhaps hoping to throw the Louisiana senator off balance before he could mount a coherent challenge to her proposals. Her attack on Kennedy's home state was deliberately personal, designed to embarrass him and undermine his credibility. The packed committee room buzzed with tension. Staffers exchanged glances, wondering how Kennedy would respond to such a direct provocation. Journalists leaned forward in the press area, sensing a moment that might dominate the news cycle. Waters' allies on the committee nodded in approval, believing she had effectively silenced a potential threat to her banking regulation package. But they had severely underestimated John Kennedy. As Waters concluded her attack, Kennedy's expression remained unchanged. He didn't appear angry or flustered. In fact, he appeared almost pleased, as if Waters had walked directly into a trap he had carefully set. The mysterious folder in front of him was about to change everything. "Thank you, Chairwoman Waters, for those colorful remarks about my home state," Kennedy began, his Louisiana drawl more pronounced than usual. "Where I come from, we believe in hearing people out before passing judgment. Perhaps that's a custom not practiced in your district." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Kennedy was responding not with anger, but with a calm that somehow made the tension in the room even more palpable. "Now, since you've brought up the subject of financial management," Kennedy continued, "I think it's only fair that we examine the record." He opened the folder that had been sitting before him, its contents still hidden from the audience and cameras. Waters shifted slightly in her seat, her expression changing from confidence to the first hints of concern. She hadn't expected Kennedy to remain so composed after her attack. "Chairwoman Waters, you've served your district for more than 30 years, Kennedy said, glancing down at the papers before him. "That's an impressive tenure. But I'm curious about something." He paused, adjusting his glasses. "Given your passionate advocacy for financial accountability, I wonder if you could explain some figures I have here regarding your own district's federal fund management." Waters leaned forward, her brow furrowed. "Senator Kennedy, this hearing is about your obstruction of necessary banking regulations, not about my district. Your deflection is transparent and, with all due respect, Madam Chairwoman," Kennedy interrupted, his tone still perfectly civil, "you opened this line of discussion by attacking my state's economic standing. I believe that makes comparative analysis relevant." He looked directly at Waters, his gaze steady. "Unless you'd prefer to retract your earlier comments?" The committee room had grown so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. Waters' allies looked uncomfortable, while several Republican members couldn't hide their slight smiles. Kennedy pulled out the first document from his folder. According to the Federal Audit Office report from last year, a report I'm sure you're familiar with, your district received $735 million, 0 cents, in federal infrastructure funds between 2018 and 2022. He held up the report so the cameras could clearly capture it. "Would you say that's an accurate figure, Chairwoman Waters?" Waters' expression hardened. "Senator, these figures are public record. I fail to see your point." Kennedy nodded thoughtfully. "Indeed, they are public record, which makes what I'm about to share all the more concerning." He extracted another document from his folder. "This is the Federal Infrastructure Implementation Assessment from the same period. It shows that while your district received $735 million, 0 cents, only $382 million, 0 cents, can be accounted for in completed projects." A collective gasp spread through the committee room. Kennedy wasn't attacking Waters personally, he was questioning her district's financial management, using official government reports. "That's a discrepancy of $353 million, 0 cents, Chairwoman Waters," Kennedy continued, his voice still measured but now carrying an edge. "That's nearly half the allocated funds, with no clear accounting of where they went or what they accomplished." Waters' face flushed with anger. "How dare you imply—" "Not implying anything, Madam Chairwoman," Kennedy interrupted gently. "I'm simply stating facts from federal audit reports. Facts that are particularly relevant when you're proposing regulations that would significantly impact banking practices nationwide." The tension in the room was electric. Staffers were frantically typing on their phones, presumably alerting their bosses to the unexpected turn the hearing had taken. Journalists in the press section were scribbling notes furiously. Waters regained her composure and launched a counterattack. "Senator Kennedy, you're deliberately misrepresenting normal infrastructure implementation timelines. Projects take years to complete, and funds are allocated in advance. This is a shameful attempt to distract from your own state's failures." Kennedy nodded, as if he had anticipated this exact response. A fair point about implementation timelines, Chairwoman Waters, which is why I have this third document. He removed another paper from his folder. This is a comparative analysis of infrastructure fund utilization across all congressional districts due to your district ranks in the bottom 10% for completed projects relative to allocated funds over a 5-year period. He paused to let that sink in. In fact, when we adjust for population and project scope, your district's performance is particularly concerning. According to this same federal report, similar urban districts managed to implement 70–80% of their allocated funds within the same time frame. Your district managed just 52%. The Republican committee members were now openly smiling. One even let out a low whistle. Waters' Democratic allies looked increasingly uncomfortable, some avoiding eye contact with their chairwoman. Waters, never one to back down from a fight, shifted tactics. Senator Kennedy, these disparate statistics are meaningless without context. My district has unique challenges that your cherry-picked numbers don't reflect. Kennedy tilted his head slightly. Unique challenges? Madam Chairwoman, I believe every district has unique challenges. My state certainly does, as you so eloquently pointed out earlier. His voice remained calm, but his words carried weight. The difference is, when Louisiana receives federal funds, we account for every dollar. He pulled out yet another document. This is the Federal Audit Compliance Report from 2021. Louisiana ranks in the top 15 states for federal fund accountability. California, I'm afraid, ranks 37th. And your district specifically was flagged for concerning patterns of incomplete documentation. He held up the report for the cameras. Those aren't my words, Madam Chairwoman. They're the words of federal auditors. The committee room was now buzzing with whispers. Waters' attack on Kennedy had completely backfired. Instead of embarrassing the Louisiana senator, she now found herself on the defensive, facing uncomfortable questions about her own district's financial management. A Democratic senator attempted to intervene. Mr. Chairman, I believe we've strayed far from the topic of today's hearing. Perhaps we could, with respect, Kennedy interjected, I believe the chairwoman established the relevance of financial management competence when she questioned my state's economic standing. I'm simply responding with factual information that bears directly on her credibility to propose sweeping financial regulations. The committee chairman nodded reluctantly, unable to deny the logical connection. Waters, visibly frustrated, tried another approach. Senator Kennedy, these administrative matters have nothing to do with banking regulations. You're creating a smokescreen to protect your banking donors. Kennedy smiled slightly. Chairwoman Waters, you've served in Congress for over 3 decades. During that time, my state has certainly faced its challenges. But when it comes to transparency in how we handle taxpayer dollars, the record speaks for itself. He closed his folder deliberately. And speaking of donors, would you like me to open discussion about campaign contributions? Because I have another folder right here. He patted a second folder that no one had noticed until now. Waters' eyes widened slightly. The room fell silent again, all eyes on Maxine Waters. For perhaps the first time in her long political career, the famously outspoken congresswoman seemed at a loss for words. The silence stretched uncomfortably as Waters appeared to be calculating her next move. Kennedy waited patiently, the second mysterious folder now sitting prominently on the table before him. The entire committee room remained frozen in anticipation. Finally, Waters spoke, her voice noticeably less confident than before. Senator Kennedy, your insinuations about my district are based on selective reading of complex reports. I've always been transparent with my constituents about how federal funds are used. Kennedy nodded thoughtfully. Transparency is indeed crucial, Chairwoman Waters. Which brings me to a more fundamental question. He opened the second folder and pulled out a stack of papers bound together. This is the complete transcript of your committee's closed-door session from March 17th, where these banking regulations were initially drafted. Waters' expression changed instantly. The closed-door session transcripts weren't supposed to be publicly available. Several Democratic staffers in the background looked at each other in alarm. I've highlighted some particularly interesting exchanges, Kennedy continued, turning pages deliberately. On page 43 you stated, and I quote, These regulations will finally give us leverage over the regional banks that have been backing Republican candidates. If they want regulatory relief, they'll need to reconsider their political activities. The committee room erupted in shocked murmurs. If authentic, this quote suggested Waters was using banking regulations as political leverage, an enormous scandal. That's taken out of context, Waters stammered, visibly rattled. Is it? Kennedy replied calmly. Then perhaps you can provide the context for this statement. On page 57, where you told a colleague, the beauty of these regulations is that they'll hit hardest in red states, where community banks can't absorb the compliance costs. Their congressmen will have to come begging for exemptions. The Republican committee members were now openly exchanging shocked glances. Even some Democratic members looked deeply concerned. These transcripts are confidential committee documents, Waters declared, finding her voice again. How did you obtain them? This is a violation of committee rules. Kennedy's expression remained unchanged. These transcripts were provided to me by a concerned committee staffer who believed the American people deserved to know the true motivation behind these regulations. He looked directly at Waters. And their authenticity can be easily verified by comparing them to the official records. He turned another page. But let's continue. On page 82, you discussed targeting specific banks in Louisiana, Texas, and Florida because, and again I quote, these institutions have been backbone financial supporters of our opposition. It's time they learned their consequences. The committee chairman, looking increasingly uncomfortable, finally intervened. Senator Kennedy, while these allegations are serious, we cannot verify the authenticity of these transcripts in this setting. Kennedy nodded respectfully. Of course, Mr. Chairman, which is why I've already submitted these documents to the Senate Ethics Committee and the Department of Justice for investigation. And he looked directly at Waters. If Chairwoman Waters believes these transcripts are inaccurate or have been tampered with, I'm sure she'll cooperate fully with their examination. Waters appeared momentarily speechless, a sight few in Washington had ever witnessed. The fiery congresswoman who never backed down from a fight seemed genuinely blindsided. But Kennedy wasn't finished. He extracted one final document from his folder. While the committee and appropriate authorities examine those transcripts, I'd like to direct everyone's attention to something that isn't disputed: the actual text of the proposed regulations. He held up what appeared to be a heavily annotated copy of Waters' banking regulation proposal. My staff and I spent the weekend analyzing the 342-page document. We identified 37 provisions that would disproportionately impact banks in Republican-leaning states, while creating carve-outs that would benefit institutions in primarily Democratic districts. Kennedy turned to the committee chairman. Mr. Chairman, I've prepared a detailed analysis of each provision with citations to the specific text and comparative impact assessments. I'd like to submit this for the record and suggest we postpone further discussion of these regulations until this apparent political targeting can be properly investigated. The chairman, clearly struggling to maintain control of the hearing, nodded. The document will be accepted for the record, and in light of these serious allegations, I believe a brief recess would be appropriate. But Kennedy held up his hand. Before we recess, Mr. Chairman, I have one final question for Chairwoman Waters. He turned to face Waters directly. Madam Chairwoman, earlier you questioned my state's economic standing and my right to participate in these discussions. In light of what we've reviewed today, the federal audit report showing concerning financial management in your district, and these transcript excerpts suggesting political motivation behind these regulations, I have a simple question. Do you still believe I'm unqualified to evaluate your banking proposals? The room fell completely silent. Every eye was on Maxine Waters, waiting for her response. For several long seconds, she simply stared at Kennedy, her expression unreadable. Then, in an unprecedented moment, she gathered her papers without a word and signaled to an aide. I believe we should recess, she said quietly to the chairman, avoiding Kennedy's gaze entirely. As the chairman announced a 1-hour recess, the committee room burst into activity. Journalists rushed out to report on the explosive confrontation. Staffers huddled in urgent discussions, and committee members from both parties gathered in separate groups, speaking in hushed tones. Through it all, John Kennedy calmly returned his documents to their folders, his expression betraying nothing but a quiet confidence. In less than 15 minutes, he had completely reversed the dynamic of the hearing, leaving the normally unflappable Maxine Waters retreating in disarray. It was a political masterclass that would be discussed in Washington for years to come. The shockwaves from the Kennedy-Waters confrontation spread through Washington with unprecedented speed. Even before the committee reconvened, video clips of the exchange were racing across social media platforms, garnering millions of views within hours. Fox News immediately cut into regular programming with breaking news coverage. Senator John Kennedy exposes potential political targeting in banking regulations. CNN took a more measured approach with the headline, "Explosive Allegations in Senate Banking Hearing, Waters Denies Wrongdoing." But even left-leaning outlets couldn't ignore the story, with MSNBC running, "Kennedy claims political motivation behind banking rules, Democrats question source of documents." Outside the hearing room, journalists swarmed committee members seeking comments. Republican Senator Tim Scott didn't hold back. What we witnessed today was the exposure of what many of us have long suspected. These regulations aren't about protecting consumers, they're about political power. Senator Kennedy did the American people a great service today. Democratic allies of Waters attempted damage control. Senator Elizabeth Warren told reporters, "Let's be clear. These are unverified claims based on documents of questionable origin." Chairwoman Waters has been a champion for financial accountability, which is exactly why she's being targeted with these smear tactics. But the visual Waters, normally so combative and quick with a retort, leaving the hearing without directly answering Kennedy's challenge, had made an indelible impression. Social media exploded with hashtags like Waters Exposed and Kennedy Takedown trending nationwide. Conservative commentator Sean Hannity opened his show that evening with, "Today, Senator John Kennedy did something few have managed. He left Maxine Waters speechless." Using nothing but documented facts and her own words, he exposed what appears to be a politically motivated scheme disguised as banking regulation. Liberal host Rachel Maddow took a different approach. "We need to ask serious questions about how confidential committee transcripts ended up in Senator Kennedy's hands." This breach of protocol may actually be the bigger story here. When the committee reconvened after the recess, the dynamic had completely changed. Waters returned, composed but noticeably more subdued. The chairman announced that in light of the serious allegations raised, the committee would postpone consideration of the banking regulations pending a review by the Senate Ethics Committee. Waters made a brief statement. "I categorically deny any political motivation behind these necessary consumer protections." The selective and out-of-context quotes presented by Senator Kennedy do not accurately reflect our committee's deliberations. "I welcome a full investigation that will clear my name and allow us to move forward with these critical regulations." Kennedy, for his part, remained measured in victory. "Mr. Chairman, I appreciate Chairwoman Waters' willingness to submit to an investigation. The American people deserve banking regulations based on sound financial principles, not political calculations. I look forward to working with colleagues from both parties to develop rules that protect consumers without unfairly targeting institutions based on their geographic location or perceived political leanings." The immediate impact on the banking regulations was clear. They were effectively dead in the water. No progress would be made while the investigation was pending, and the political appetite for Waters' approach had evaporated in the face of Kennedy's revelations. But the after effects extended far beyond this single policy initiative. Within days, several news organizations filed Freedom of Information Act requests for the complete transcripts of the Banking Committee's closed-door sessions. Conservative watchdog groups announced their own investigations into Waters' district's use of federal infrastructure funds. The political consequences were equally significant. Waters, long considered untouchable in her heavily Democratic district, suddenly faced questions from local media about the infrastructure spending discrepancies Kennedy had highlighted. While her core supporters remained loyal, polls showed increased voter concern about financial management. For Kennedy, the confrontation elevated his national profile dramatically. Once viewed primarily as a reliable conservative vote with a penchant for folksy quotes, he was now being discussed as a formidable political strategist who had outmaneuvered one of Washington's most experienced operators. Republican leaders took note. Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell was overheard telling colleagues Kennedy didn't just win an argument, he changed the entire conversation on banking regulation. That's the kind of effectiveness we need. 3 days after the hearing, the Wall Street Journal published an investigative piece confirming several of Kennedy's allegations about infrastructure fund mismanagement in Waters' district. The article, citing internal federal audit documents, reported that at least $118 million, 0 cents in federal funds, had been allocated to projects that showed no progress after 3 years. With minimal documentation explaining the delays, Waters' office issued a statement blaming administrative complications and pandemic disruptions. But the damage was done. Her reputation as a fierce defender of proper financial management had been severely undermined. Meanwhile, Kennedy received a hero's welcome upon returning to Louisiana. At a town hall in Baton Rouge, he was greeted with a standing ovation. "I wasn't trying to embarrass anyone," he told the crowd in his characteristic drawl. "I just believe that if you're going to throw stones, you ought not live in a glass house. And if you're going to write banking rules for the whole country, you ought to make sure your own financial house is in order first." The confrontation also had significant implications for future congressional hearings. Committee chairs from both parties began reviewing their procedures for closed-door sessions, with several implementing new security measures for sensitive transcripts. 2 weeks after the hearing, the Senate Ethics Committee announced a formal investigation into the allegations of political motivation behind the banking regulations. In a rare move, the committee's announcement explicitly mentioned that they would be examining both the substance of Kennedy's allegations and the means by which he obtained the confidential transcripts. Political analysts debated the long-term significance of the confrontation. On CNN's State of the Union, political commentator David Axelrod observed, "What makes this moment so remarkable isn't just that Kennedy caught Waters off guard, it's that he did it with her own words and official documents. This wasn't partisan mudslinging, it was a carefully planned and executed political checkmate." Conservative commentator Ben Shapiro was more blunt. Waters made the classic mistake of underestimating her opponent. She saw Kennedy's folksy manner and thought she was dealing with a lightweight. What she got instead was a Harvard Law graduate who had done his homework and was ready to call her bluff. Perhaps the most telling aftermath came during a House Financial Services Committee meeting 3 weeks later, when a Republican congressman began questioning the political motivations behind a different regulatory proposal. Waters, instead of dismissing the inquiry, as she might have in the past, responded with detailed policy justifications and offered to provide supporting documentation. It was a subtle but unmistakable change in approach, evidence of the lasting impact of her confrontation with Kennedy. The Washington Post noted this shift in an analysis piece titled "The Kennedy Effect: How One Senate Hearing Changed the Tone of Financial Regulation Debates." 6 months later, when a revised version of the banking regulations finally emerged, it bore little resemblance to Waters' original proposal. The new version, co-sponsored by moderate members of both parties, eliminated the provisions Kennedy had identified as targeting Republican-leaning states and included explicit protections for regional and community banks. When asked about these changes during a press conference, Waters briefly acknowledged that the confrontation with Kennedy had contributed to a more balanced approach. It was as close to an admission of defeat as the proud Congresswoman would ever come. For John Kennedy, the confrontation with Waters became a defining moment in his political career. While he had always been respected for his intelligence and wit, he was now viewed as a strategic power player who had fundamentally altered the trajectory of major financial legislation. During a fundraising dinner in New Orleans later that year, Kennedy reflected on the confrontation with his characteristic understated humor. "You know, back home in Louisiana, we have a saying, 'Don't wrestle with a pig.' You both get dirty, and the pig likes it. But sometimes, when someone's trying to push bad policy that would hurt your constituents, you have to be willing to step into the mud and do what needs doing. The audience erupted in laughter and applause, recognizing the homespun wisdom that masked Kennedy's razor-sharp political instincts, the same combination that had left Maxine Waters speechless on that unforgettable day in Washington. As journalists and political scientists would later note, the Kennedy-Waters confrontation represented more than just a momentary political victory. It demonstrated how preparation, strategic thinking, and command of facts could overcome even the most entrenched political power. It was a masterclass in effective opposition, not through shouting or personal attacks, but through methodical exposure of inconsistency and questionable motives. In the end, Kennedy hadn't just won an argument, he had changed the entire conversation around banking regulation and established a new standard for accountability in Washington. And he had done it all with a calm demeanor, a southern drawl, and a pair of folders that no one saw coming. If you enjoy this breakdown of how Senator Kennedy left Maxine Waters speechless, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our coverage of the biggest political showdowns in Washington. And leave a comment below telling us which political confrontation you'd like us to cover next.